Welcome to episode 78 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, ringing in from the Florida Keys again this week, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic, and I want to provide an update on T-Mobile and its fixed wireless access rollout. It had an initial goal of 500,000 subscribers by the end of the year. It's already met that goal. It is almost approaching mid-December, so they made it by a hair. So by all measures, they're executing very successfully. In comparison, Verizon, as of their fiscal 3Q, they were only up to 150,000. And AT&T has been very focused, obviously, with its GigaFiber product, so they've been less focused on fixed wireless access. But I think this is a tremendous accomplishment for T-Mobile. But the question is, can this lead to other subscriber revenue pools? And I think it can. I've talked in the past about how traditionally T-Mobile has been very consumer-centric in its services, but I do believe this provides a solid bedrock for them to build upon. And this should lead to additional consumer revenue opportunities for them as well as enterprise. But would love to get your take on it, buddy.
Yeah, well, first I was going to say, I can tell you're in the Florida Keys because of the fishing poles.
That's
Um,
right.
but I think T-Mobile has shown that their mid-band network is really the core of this, and
Hmm.
I think Verizon will be able to extend their market size and the potential amount of customers they serve with their mid-band spectrum once they roll it out, which we'll be talking about later in the podcast.
Hmm.
But I think that most of Verizon's fixed wireless ambitions will transition to mid-band, and millimeter wave will be, as they see fit. I don't think they're going to be as aggressive in rolling out millimeter wave once they start rolling out mid-band, which is something I'll be
Right.
talking about as well.
Hmm.
And I think T-Mobile's accomplishments here are very legitimate, and I think their momentum will only continue to carry forward as they continue to build out this 2.5 gigahertz mid-band spectrum and increase their pops beyond the 200 million they claim today into 250 and 300 million in subsequent years. So
Hmm.
I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. To your point, to enable small businesses. I think there's a huge opportunity
Hmm.
to enable small businesses because today, both my parents are former small business owners, and I remember the process of trying to get internet to them and the prices they paid and the service they got. And I think there's a lot of small businesses out there that really could benefit from this, and that's ultimately one of the biggest economic drivers I think we could possibly have with these fixed wireless rollouts.
I agree. And I think you're spot on with respect to where T-Mobile should start to build its business service footprint. Should definitely be in the mid-market because that's an easier stretch than to jump right into enterprise and compete with AT&T and Verizon that have been well entrenched for a number of years. So time will tell, but kudos to T-Mobile on that accomplishment. But let's move to your first topic this week. And we've been talking a lot about the FAA and aviation interference concerns with C-band, and you want to provide an update. I saw this news break this week as well.
Yeah, so the FAA came out with two like directives basically that say that there will need to be restrictions for pilots operating automatic landing and other cockpit systems that are dependent on ground-based or the radar that operates in the 4.2 gigahertz spectrum. So the interesting part is it specifically states that it's about bad weather conditions, which is when you lack line of sight as a pilot. But ultimately, I don't think it really solves the issue here um, of whether or not there really is enough interference to prevent planes from accurately calculating their altitude and safely. I think that there should be pilot tests of this with 5G rolled out in an area where, it isn't as much of a concern, and fly a plane and try and land it and see if it affects the equipment at all. And I just don't think we ever got that. Um,
Mhm.
all the data the FAA has is based on like helicopter test trials, and even then it was really questionable whether we're actually using a 3GPP compliant network. Um, and the numbers, I think it was like there's something like 6,000 planes, 6,834 airplanes and 1,828 helicopters. So it's not even like the vast majority of planes and helicopters out there today. It's actually
Mhm.
probably a very small percentage, because a lot of these are older equipment. So I think that there should be a combination of um, slowly phasing these devices out, and upgrading them to ones with filters,
Yeah.
and also, lowering power transmissions in these areas to a level that is considered acceptable. I think both parties need to make concessions, but at this
Right.
point, the FAA is operating almost in a way that does not create concessions. And the climate where this had been created was simply a lack of um, communication and um, willingness to work together between the FAA and the FCC, because obviously they have very different end goals, and there are some political um, you know concessions here as well that will probably need to be made, because the FCC was able to gather upwards of $90 billion, but or $80 billion, but the FAA got none of it, right? So they probably are
Right.
also wanting some of a piece of that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I just think that this situation is going to hurt Verizon and AT&T, but the good thing is that it will probably continue to roll out forward, and
Yeah.
eventually we'll figure out the band situation specifically, and what the power levels will have to be. But as it is right now, the FAA is trying to use this poison pill and saying, oh, now we're going to have to cancel and delay all kinds of flights because of this directive.
Yeah.
And until we solve this solution, it's really going to hurt the airline industry. And of course, there's tons of lobbying and lots of money involved with that component of the industry, and
Yeah.
how many times they've been bailed out. So
Right.
um, yeah, at this point, I think that this has become a much bigger issue. And the truth is, everyone who understands the potential of 5G understands how critically important this is to the U.S. economy and our
Mhm.
growth as a nation to roll 5G out. So we can't just, act like 5G isn't viable. And to a lot of other people's points, Europe has 5G in the same band,
Right.
and it hasn't been as big of a problem as it is in the U.S. And
Yeah.
they rolled out their 5G around the same time as we have, and they rolled it out earlier. So I haven't heard of any planes crashing due to 5G. So I think it's a very questionable starting point for this discussion.
Yeah. It's interesting the timing of this all as we hopefully are exiting the pandemic, although we're seeing Omicron, crop up, obviously. But, this may be to your point, talking about the lobby effort with the airlines. The airlines have been severely financially handicapped with the lack of travel over the last 2 years. This may be somewhat of an overcorrection. Maybe the lobbyists that aren't educated enough about 5G are convincing, Hubi, and the federal government, about these concerns. But it'll be interesting. I did read about, this concern around the power related to it as well. And I guess my understanding, right, is that's a temporary measure, right, for
Six
AT&T
months.
and Verizon to power down, right, in the spectrum.
I mean, the thing is that by all means, U.S. carriers have all kinds of problems, right?
Yeah.
They're not angels, but it really feels like the operators have made as many concessions as they could,
Sure.
and the airline industry and the FAA have just almost been, at least initially, were not very receptive to any of it.
Right.
So it feels very imbalanced.
Hmm.
And these operators spent tens of billions of dollars on this spectrum, and it's like
Yep.
nobody really addressed this issue until like a month before they were about to roll out their spectrum.
Right. There needs to be definitely some middle ground here, but I'm sure we're going to continue to monitor the situation and report on it future podcasts. But let's move to my second topic this week, and I want to talk about Verizon. Their CEO, Mr. Vestberg, is quite confident. I will give Verizon credit. I believe relative to their other competitors in the US, they've done a fine job of espousing the actual practical benefits of 5G with their 7 currencies or 8 currencies or 5 currencies or whatever that is. But this week, Mr. Vestberg came out and spoke to the fact that he believed that Verizon had a 2-year advantage over its major competitors in the US. Very ambiguous statement. And even went as far as to say that he felt like that they had an advantage over other carriers on a global basis. Now, from my perspective, I follow Verizon very closely. They are sometimes they play things very close to the chest. They're not as open and and as expressive with the analyst community as their other competitors in the US are. But I will give them credit from a mobile edge computing perspective. They have been the most aggressive. If you just go to their press, release website and view all of the, the releases with AWS and what they're doing to enable MEC, that makes perfect sense because their priority in deploying 5G has been in the millimeter wave band with their ultra wideband service. But I got to throw some cold water on the fact that they're 2 years ahead of all of their other competitors. Would love to get your insights on this.
Yeah, sorry, I had a little visitor here. I think that when you look at where they are today, was there a specific claim of what they were 2 years ahead on?
I think it was just a very general blanket statement, but then as I double clicked into it, it was sort of centered on what they're doing with building out edge computing
I mean,
capabilities.
I can give them that I feel like they are ahead. I don't know about 2 years ahead. I think that 2 years ahead statement is very likely a very specific number because I have a feeling T-Mobile will probably be using the 2 years ahead claim on Verizon when it comes to midband, when they roll out midband. So I think this is more of a reactive statement, or even a preemptive reactive statement, right? So they're trying to preempt what they think T-Mobile is going to message around midband because obviously AT&T can't do that because they're rolling it out together. So I think that they're trying to show some kind of leadership in a way that they couldn't do before. And I think that when you look at what the climate is like for them, they do have a pretty good lead on mobile edge compute, but mobile edge compute's useless if you don't have coverage.
Right. I agree. It's interesting. Well, we'll keep our ears and eyes open on that one. Let's move to your second topic this week, and you want to provide a few updates with respect to regional 5G deployment, starting with AT&T.
Yeah, so AT&T is pretty big in Mexico. They've made some acquisitions there that and have grown their network there to be a pretty strong competitor in the 5G space. And I've used their 4G back pre-pandemic when I was in Mexico, and it's fantastic. So I'm excited to see what they're going to do there with their 5G rollout in Mexico, which is beginning now. Another carrier, TIM Brazil, which is an Italian carrier but has their Brazilian office, is rolling out 5G in Brazil as well as in Germany. One of the telecom regulators has stated that Germany has between all of its carriers covered a total of 53% of the country, which is a fairly large country, one of the biggest in Europe, if not the. And I think France might actually be bigger. But the truth is that like they said that at least one carrier is providing 5G coverage in 53% of the country. So it's not all carriers, but that's still pretty good. And we'll see what happens, as things move forward. But yeah, it's very interesting development. It's good to see global 5G is rolling out, and we're going to continue to see momentum, especially as countries like India start to light stuff up later next year.
Yeah, Europe has been somewhat behind the US and China, and I've spoken to that on prior podcasts. That's really related to all of the different countries' separate regulations with respect to spectrum auctions and deployment and that sort of thing. So you've got to give Europe a little bit of credit, but they're pulling through pretty quickly. I'm not surprised to see Germany sort of leading the pack there. Germany is a very tech savvy country in general when you look at just the kind of the adoption of technology in general. So it is encouraging to see that other parts of the world are stepping up and making 5G a reality. I'm wondering, did you double click into the Germany story, and what percentage of that is non-standalone versus standalone?
I definitely don't know that detail.
Okay,
I think we'll have to look into it more, but I have a feeling the number's probably pretty low right now.
sure.
Um, but I think that's probably something we'll have a much better idea for later next year,
Yeah,
because so many countries and so many operators are planning to roll out standalone next year.
makes sense. Makes sense. Didn't want to put you on the spot, but I was just curious there. But let's move to my third and final topic this week. I want to talk about NTT, and they commissioned an enterprise survey, and they wanted to find out where companies were at in their consideration of adopting private 5G. I've talked about this quite a bit on prior podcasts, and it was quite bullish. So some of the results were, and by the way, this survey was conducted by the Economist Impact for NTT. So, and they surveyed IT executives in Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And so it was interesting. Over 80%, more than 4 in 5 CIOs and senior leaders plan to deploy private 5G networks within the next 2 years. That's no surprise to me. I think especially in companies that are manufacturers, and I've spoken to this in the past, I believe over half the addressable market for private 5G will be in factory automation and that sort of thing. So this just sort of reinforces sort of what I already know, but it's also interesting. NTT has partnered with Celona, and I've spoken about Celona on prior podcasts. They were one of the first out of the gate with 5G as a service offering. Celona is leveraging HPE's extensive channel partner network to for referrals and that sort of thing to sell it in, and they've experienced a lot of early success. So I don't know necessarily if that's coloring sort of NTT's conclusion that they want to take to the market, but certainly NTT as a partner of Celona's may have a vested interest there. But wondering if you have any additional insight you like that.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think the countries that would benefit from private 5G the most will be the ones who do a lot of manufacturing,
Mm-hmm.
like the Japans, like the Germanys, and we're seeing them lead the charge. So I think it's very fitting that we would see someone like an NTT do this kind of thing and see where business are at. But I would also say that a lot of Japanese businesses tend to be on the more conservative side.
Yeah.
So we'll see, how uptake looks, but I think it's important that their governments and their carriers are realizing um, what their companies might need before they even know it, and helping to mature that ecosystem ahead of, those companies' willingness or readiness to adopt the technology.
Yeah, great insights. Well, let's go with your third and final topic. You want to talk about Verizon as well.
Yeah, so in addition to making those claims around 5G leadership,
Mm-hmm.
um, they also talked about the fact that they exceeded their expectations for millimeter wave, with rollouts of their millimeter wave sites, hitting, I think, 14,000 additional sites, as well as being able to transition their focus towards C-band, which makes total sense when you consider the fact that, um, uh, as I had mentioned earlier in the podcast, I have a feeling Verizon's going to refocus its rollout of 5G infrastructure, to be very heavily C-band focused. And while I don't think they've made commitments to millimeter wave in the future, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
numbers, which we know they'll still very much use millimeter wave, and they're going to take advantage of a lot of the deployments they have today, taking advantage of
Sure.
millimeter wave. They've
Yeah.
already shown some carrier aggregation of millimeter wave with midband, and that was upwards of 4 gigabits per second. So there is already some talk of utilizing that millimeter wave footprint to benefit midband. But
Yeah.
they do say that they expect C-band rollout to be 100 million pops by Q1 of this year, and then 250 million by the end of 2024. So it's going to be, I would say, a bit of a slower rollout than some people would expect.
Yeah.
But it's clear that they've been building to this rollout, because 100 million pops in the first quarter of your deployment.
Super aggressive. That's
Yeah,
super aggressive, right?
it's pretty good. But
Yeah.
to me, it looks like it's a spike and then like a slow ascent,
Well,
because by 2024, I believe T-Mobile will have over 300 million pops.
mhm.
I think that their claim is what, 200 now, and then 250. So they'll have 300 million pops before a year before that. So
Sure.
it's going to be very interesting to see where um, Verizon lands. But to this point, 250 million is T-Mobile's target by the end of next year. So that hits that 2-year advantage, and that's why I think we heard Hans mentioning their 2-year advantage.
Yeah, it's interesting, the jockeying back and forth for pops and claims and that sort of thing. But from my perspective, and you and I called this very early on, even before the merger closed, T-Mobile has been executing. Mr. Sievert, Mr. Neville Ray, they've been executing against their spectrum portfolio. But at some point, AT&T and Verizon in the U.S. will catch up. It's just a matter of time. But it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out at the end. But this has been another great podcast, my friend. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone would like to reach out to us to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for another podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Will Town Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.